Hey, remember how the Second World War kicked off in Asia with the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941? Well, it turns out this attack was brewing for a while. About 10 years earlier, in September 1931, the Japanese army invaded Manchuria, sparking tensions that led to this big event. Now, there's this guy named General Kanji Ishiwara, who was all about this war stuff. He lived in a time when things were changing fast, especially in Japan. Japan was trying to keep up with modern times, but it was clashing with its traditional ways. Ishiwara was one of those officers who went to Germany to learn military tactics. When he got back to Tokyo, he brought back some not so great ideas from Germany, like this whole concept of total war, which the Nazis were into. In Japan, things were getting tough for the regular folks, especially after the economic crisis in 1929. A bunch of young Japanese officers, including Ishiwara, felt like they needed to do something fast to save their country from what they saw as Western meddling. But here's the kicker. The Japanese government couldn't really control the military, which was only taking orders from Emperor Hirohito. And the emperor? Well, he wasn't exactly the strongest leader, so the army started getting more aggressive. Ishiwara, who was part of this intense militarist group, believed in this whole final war thing, where Japan would come out on top, ruling the world under the emperor's command. It was a pretty extreme idea, but that's the world Ishiwara and others like him were living in. So there's this guy who got sent to Manchuria to keep an eye on things after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Japan was supposed to have a limited number of troops there, just 10,000, and they weren't even supposed to use big weapons. They had to stay close to the railway. Now, Manchuria was a pretty important spot, with borders touching China, the USSR, and Korea, which Japan took over in 1910. The United States was keeping a close eye on it all because any small thing could cause big problems in the area. But here's the thing, Ishiwara, like many other officers, wanted to stir up trouble there. The pictures you're seeing show how they were getting ready to invade Manchuria, which led to the Sino-Japanese War. Ishiwara, the guy behind the plan, later lied about it all, saying it wasn't planned out in advance. Another important guy in all of this was Colonel Seishiro Itagaki. And there was also Colonel Tetsu and Nagata, who were helping out. They got transferred to Dalian, and it was all part of a plan to keep things practical, according to Nagata. So this guy had big plans for Manchuria. He wanted to make it a huge storage place for Japan's army by using the land for farming and tapping into all the iron and coal there. He watched World War I unfold in Europe and started thinking that total war was the way to go. And when it came to launching an attack, he picked Mukden as the starting point. It was a smart move because Mukden was right in the middle of things, making it easy to send troops out from there. So Ishiwara had this sneaky plan to invade Manchuria, but he knew Tokyo wouldn't be on board with it. So he kept everything super secret, with a little help from Nagata and Itagaki. They figured they'd just go ahead and do it, then tell the government afterward, leaving them no choice but to go along with it. Their cover story was that they were just checking out Japan's defense system, but really, they were plotting this big offensive. And guess what? The higher-ups signed off on it. Everyone had their role to play. Nagata acted like he didn't know what was going on and went back to Tokyo. He took a big risk by trusting Ishiwara with Asia's fate. Ishiwara's plan was to make it look like the Chinese attacked first, so they could justify invading Manchuria as self-defense. They cooked up this whole scheme in a little office, and then boom! They set off a bomb near the Chinese troops. Chaos ensued with buildings wrecked and people killed. Before long, Mukden was under Japanese control, and Ishiwara sent word to Tokyo, acting like they needed reinforcements urgently to save Japanese residents. So back in Japan, the emperor found out there was a big fight happening in Manchuria. In Tokyo, people were freaking out. See, Hirohito, the emperor, didn't want to make things worse with China, so he said no more troops. The government said, okay, stop fighting, but Ishiwara wasn't having it. He started spreading lies to make people in Japan think he was doing the right thing. Meanwhile, China asked the League of Nations for help. But here's the thing, even though Japan said they'd cooperate, nobody could really do anything to stop the army. Ishiwara saw this as his chance to take over Manchuria, and all the Japanese officers there joined in on the attack. Ishiwara was worried that Tokyo might stop the fighting, so he and the other officers decided to grab as much land as they could, as fast as they could, to make it too late to change course. They took over city after city, with the Chinese mostly putting up symbolic resistance. Ishiwara's soldiers were well prepared and followed his orders to use the railroad to move up north. Even though Tokyo didn't agree, troops from Korea were brought in to help. Ishiwara's army kept moving forward, but they faced tough fighting in the north. Wow! Imagine fighting in freezing blizzards at minus 37 degrees Celsius with no shelter or supplies. That's exactly what the Japanese soldiers did back in November 1931 when they marched into Tsitsijar, tired but victorious. But for the people living there, it marked the start of 14 tough years under Japanese rule. Ishiwara, one of the leaders, showed how determined he was by sacrificing a fifth of his men. He became pretty famous for it. Back in Japan, Ishiwara's successes fired up patriotic feelings. People held big celebrations and rallies as troops headed to northern China. The whole country was caught up in nationalist excitement. Meanwhile, about 2,000 kilometers away, the Japanese army, inspired by their earlier victories, kept pushing their aggressive plans. They attacked Shanghai on January 28, 1932, shocking the world. Japanese planes bombed the city, sending terrified people fleeing. The Chinese army fought hard, leading to intense battles. In Shanghai, the Westerners were mostly focused on protecting their own interests. They beefed up the defense around their areas. People worldwide spoke out against the Japanese army's brutality. The League of Nations got worried and sent a group to try to make peace in the Far East. Eventually, they managed to get a ceasefire signed in Shanghai. It was a shaky peace that only lasted 5 years. In Japan, some groups were stirring up hate and fear. The more moderate folks kept quiet because they were scared. If anyone dared to speak out, they were accused of betraying the country and being traitors. In this tense and violent atmosphere, there's always someone extreme enough to resort to killing. The new war minister, General Saddam Iraqi, didn't hold back in stirring up trouble. He used the media to slam the parliamentary system that was still around. There was this propaganda film called Japan in a State of Emergency that basically said, "This is serious, no time for fun." Iraqi thought the Democrats in charge were clueless about the dangers the country faced. There's this little girl in the film who represents Japan's new beginning. While she works hard, her lazy parents are out partying. She thinks about the soldiers fighting in Manchuria for Japan's sake. But her parents, who are more into Western ways, don't care and run her over on their way home from the club. The film's message was all about how civilian society needed to shape up and support the brave army. This patriotic stuff really struck a chord with the military folks. They looked up to Ishiwara and tried to be just as bold and daring as him. But some took it too far and did senseless terrorist acts, like on May 15, 1932, when 9 young naval officers broke into the Prime Minister's residence and killed him. They saw him as a symbol of the country's messed up parliamentary system. So, Charlie Chaplin, the famous actor, was lucky to escape death when the Prime Minister got assassinated. The assassins had also planned to kill him to spark a war with the United States. But when reporters asked Chaplin about it, he was surprised because he was British, not American. The trial for the Prime Minister's killers was a joke. A nationalist group flooded the judges with letters supporting the murderers written in blood. And guess what? The scared judges only gave them a slap on the wrist with a few years in jail. These troublemaking groups were thrilled by this, seeing it as a win against the government. Regular politicians and moderates were too scared to do anything. Even the emperor stayed quiet, which made people wonder if he had any control over the army. The League of Nations got worried and sent a team, led by Lord Lytton, to find out why there was so much fighting in Manchuria. Lytton tried to explain to the Japanese officers that the world didn't like the idea of Japan taking over Chinese land and making it their own. So on March 9, 1932, they declared this new place called Manchukuo as a puppet state. It included 3 super-rich provinces in northeastern China and was way bigger than Japan itself. The flag was pretty symbolic, with yellow showing unity and 4 stripes representing bravery, justice, purity, and determination. The Japanese army kept on taking over more land, parading through the streets with drums banging and firecrackers popping. They wanted everyone to believe that the Declaration of Independence was real and that people actually wanted it. They made a big deal out of appointing Pu Yi, who used to be China's last emperor, as the leader of Manchukuo, even though he was kind of a messed up guy, addicted to opium, obedient but full of himself. He agreed to be a puppet leader just to get his title of emperor back. This move really ticked off the League of Nations, which had just started looking into what was going on. The League's crew, trying not to tick off their Japanese hosts, just went along with whatever the military planned, from fancy lunches to official dinners. So Lord Lytton's mission to investigate turned into more of a fancy train ride through Manchuria, with lots of guards and no chance to talk to regular folks. But because he wasn't allowed to see things up close, he actually figured out what was really going on in Manchukuo. His report said it was basically just a place controlled by Japan, not really independent at all. That got people talking, and in March 1933, there was a big meeting about it in Geneva. The Japanese team in Switzerland was led by Yusuke Matsuoka, a guy who really hated the West. He brought along Kanji Ishiwara, who wasn't much into diplomacy either. The League of Nations suggested putting Manchuria under international control, but when the Japanese delegation heard that, they stormed out of the meeting. This move made it pretty clear that Japan wasn't interested in peace talks anymore. They felt like they didn't have to answer to anyone. So Japan went ahead and forced this phony independent state of Manchukuo onto the world. The first person to buy into this fake state idea was Ishiwara, who had been a big shot in the Manchurian campaign. But really, everything in Manchukuo was just a show, except for training people to be soldiers. The Japanese army had this idea of making a whole new kind of person, strong, disciplined, and all about fighting. But not everyone in the army was on board with this modern way of thinking. Some old school guys thought sticking to traditional samurai values was enough to make soldiers unbeatable. Nagata, one of these old school guys, tried to get rid of the modernizers, but that didn't end well for him. He got assassinated on August 12, 1935. Ishiwara, who had been brought back to Tokyo by Nagata, took over after he was killed. Ishiwara was seen as a hero because of his role in the Manchurian campaign, so the big shots used his popularity to calm down the hot-headed young officers. But Ishiwara stayed out of the army's power struggles. So Ishiwara's main loyalty was to this Nichiren group and their big mission. He got a promotion to general and became head of the Economic Mobilization Bureau, all about getting Japan ready for war. He was dead set on making Japan a military powerhouse, getting every industry to churn out weapons and gear for the army. Planes, boats, tanks, you name it. He wanted Japan to have the strongest army in the world. And he didn't stop there. He wanted the whole country to be ready for war. But here's the thing, Ishiwara didn't think about one big problem. When they had elections in 1936, more pacifists got into parliament, which meant they weren't keen on going to war. Plus, the army was divided among themselves, so they couldn't just overthrow the government. Japan didn't have any single leader like Hitler or Mussolini to take control. That job, if it existed, would have been the emperor's. But because people thought he was a god, he couldn't just come out and talk to them directly, so he kind of relied on the military folks around him. But with all the infighting among the army factions, nobody could really grab power. So on February 26, 1936, a group of young officers and their troops basically took over Tokyo. They went on a rampage, killing anyone who got in their way. They seized control of the Ministry of War and the police headquarters, demanding a military dictatorship in the emperor's name. But the emperor, horrified by what was happening, refused to give in to their demands. Ishiwara saw that the army was falling apart and worried it would mess up his big plan to beef up Japan's military. So he stepped in and had the rebels surrounded by loyal troops. Japan was on the edge of a civil war. Ishiwara, unarmed, went out to talk to the rebel leaders and gave them a simple choice: surrender or die. This move made Ishiwara a hero, but his lack of political smarts would soon bring him down. Another guy, Hideki Toshio, who had been working behind the scenes, took advantage of the chaos to build up his own power. He had connections with the military police and spy service. Toshio ended up getting all the power, something nobody else had managed since the Mukden incident. With a disciplined army backing him, Japan was ready to rise up. The whole country got behind the military, just like in Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. But Japan added a religious twist to its militarism. The emperor became like a god, and people were fanatically devoted to him. This turned Japan into a kind of fascist religious state, gearing up for war in the name of their divine emperor. So the big shots in Japan picked Prince Fumimaro Konoe to be prime minister. He was all into Nazi stuff and loved Hitler's style. He even borrowed Hitler's idea of needing more living space and came up with this thing called the East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Basically, it was an excuse to invade China. But the connection with Nazi Germany wasn't just about ideas. Japan and Germany, along with Italy, signed this anti-communist pact to keep the Soviet Union off their backs. Even though the Soviet threat was gone, Japan had a new problem. Chiang Kai-shek's forces were getting stronger, and China still wanted Manchuria back. Chiang Kai-shek, seeing how much the Chinese people hated the Japanese, decided to stop fighting his fellow Chinese and team up against the invaders. Japan knew it had to act fast if it wanted to keep hold of Manchukuo and its resources, so they used a little fight as an excuse to start a big war against China. Ishiwara didn't think the Japanese army was ready for such a huge fight, so he ordered a ceasefire. But the officers didn't listen and launched their attack anyway, and that's how the Sino-Japanese War started again. They took Beijing, and the Chinese army pulled back, saving their best troops for Shanghai. On August 13, 1937, the Japanese bombed Shanghai like crazy and sent their Navy commandos to fight on land. It turned into the longest battle of the whole Sino-Japanese War, lasting 3 months. The same tragic scenes from 1932 played out again. There were bloody battles in neighborhoods where regular folks lived. Every building, every street was a battleground. With help from the Navy's big guns, the Japanese had the upper hand. Despite the brave resistance from Chinese soldiers, they lost the city. People tried desperately to escape the bombs raining down on them. From his office in Tokyo, Ishiwara couldn't do anything to stop the invasion, which he thought was a terrible idea. But he had started the chain of events in Manchuria, and now it was out of his hands. Dojo, the new big shot in the Kwantung Army, didn't like Ishiwara's calls for a ceasefire. He didn't want any disagreements, even from the guy who used to be a hero. So he made Ishiwara the second in command in Manchuria to keep an eye on him. Things got tense between Ishiwara and the other officers. Finally, he had enough and quit his job. He went back to Japan, hoping to get in trouble and use his trial to speak out against Toshio. But Itagaki, another big shot who used to be Ishiwara's buddy, didn't want a scandal, so he sent Ishiwara far away from the action to some boring job. The worst of the brutality happened in December 1937 when Nanking, Chiang Kai-shek's capital, fell. For 5 weeks, the city endured unimaginable horrors, like something out of the darkest times in China's history. The world was horrified. But in Japan, the capture of Nanking, led by the emperor's brother, was seen as a big military win. Roosevelt knew that a war with Japan was inevitable. Even though Chiang Kai-shek's forces were losing on the ground, he was winning the battle for public opinion. To the world, the war in China was like the Spanish Civil War. China was seen as standing up against fascism. Despite publicly staying out of it, Western countries secretly helped China. They sent weapons and supplies, and even the USSR sent loads of guns, tanks, and planes. The Japanese army made quick progress in China, grabbing almost a quarter of the country in 3 years. But in reality, they only controlled the main cities and roads. The countryside was out of their reach, thanks to Chiang Kai-shek's strategy of wearing them down instead of going for quick wins. Chiang Kai-shek was betting on the United States joining the war, which was becoming global. While things were stable in China, Europe was falling apart. Hitler attacked Poland, and one by one, the European democracies collapsed. Japan liked this chaos and got closer to Germany and Italy by signing the Tripartite Pact in September 1940. They also copied Hitler by signing a non-aggression pact with the USSR so they could focus on fighting in China. Despite their initial victories, the Japanese had a tough time breaking through in China. The Chinese fought back fiercely, and millions of people fled to the mountains to escape the violence. It was the biggest mass exodus of World War II. The Japanese faced guerrilla tactics and a whole population fighting against them. Despite their initial victories, the Japanese had a tough time breaking through in China. The Japanese faced guerrilla tactics and a whole population fighting against them. While the Japanese struggled in China, the Vichy regime in France let them into French Indochina. This gave Japan access to oil fields they needed to keep fighting. It also threatened American bases in the Philippines and cut off aid to Chinese forces. When the US told Japan to get out of Indochina, the Japanese government hesitated. But Toshio, who was now Prime Minister as well as Minister of War, decided to go for it and rejected the US demand. He figured if they backed down, they'd lose all they'd gained in China. So on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. They saw it as a fight against a new world they didn't understand. Ishiwara, who had called for total war, never faced trial for his actions. He died in 1949, but his legacy lived on in the devastation of Asia, with over 30 million dead, including 20 million in China alone. He died peacefully on August 18, 1949, in the agricultural community he had founded. Thank you for watching, my friend. Please consider subscribing and hitting the bell, and see you in the next video.